Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, of course, this should be a very interesting video to make. When we talk about some of the macro theories, some of them seem to be panning out more so than others. But in this video, I want to address a few things. Address them head on rather than pretend like it's not happening, and we can just take it from there. Okay. So the first thing is that today Bitcoin set a new yearly high, and specifically it went all the way up to 34,406. So not just a slight new high, right? It's not like we just sort of tagged this level and went down. It's actually up from this wick here, up about another 7 or 8%, about an 8% move or so off of that prior high. So it is a significant new yearly high, right? It's a significant move. So one of the things going into this year that I said, and I sort of changed my tune on it halfway through the year, but going into this year, I said I thought the price of Bitcoin would stay between 12K and 35K. That was sort of my view going into this year. But in the summer, when we did not hit 35K, I then said I think the yearly high is in. Okay? So, if you're looking for me to say I was wrong, then I was wrong. Okay? I will not get everything right. I've said that many times. I hope you can understand that. And we can just hopefully move on from there. It went higher than the prior high, and we will talk about a few of the other macro theories that seem to be playing out, and then we'll also talk about this move and to see what's really going on with it under the surface. Okay? So, the first thing we've said before in in pre-halving years is that if you want exposure to the cryptoverse, Bitcoin is where you want to be, right? We've said that for the entire year, right? If you want exposure to Cryptoverse, Bitcoin is generally where you want to be in the pre-halving year. The reason for that in the pre-halving year, you want exposure to mostly Bitcoin over the majority of the altcoin market is because the Bitcoin dominance tends to go higher. Now, before we get too far into this, I have to place a caveat because if I don't, I'm going to piss off a lot of people. Yes, I understand that some altcoins have outperformed Bitcoin. Okay, I understand. If you want to inform me of them, you can put them down in the comment section below. But I do understand that some altcoins have outperformed Bitcoin this year. Okay? At the beginning of this year, what we said was not that all altcoins would underperform. We just said that most of them would. And if most of them underperform Bitcoin, then the expectation is that the Bitcoin dominance will trend higher. Okay, that was the expectation, is that as these altcoins underperform Bitcoin collectively, the Bitcoin dominance should go higher no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD. Therefore, if you want exposure to the cryptoverse, to the potential upside, focusing on Bitcoin is likely the best option because it gives you exposure to the upside while minimizing your downside risk in the altcoin market. And I stand by that statement. We said that many times, and I still think it stands true, through today, right? In the pre-halving year, Bitcoin is generally where you want to be if you want to have exposure, and it's because the Bitcoin dominance goes higher. If you look at the Bitcoin dominance, not only did we hit 53% yesterday, we also hit 54%, 54.26%. Now, we've been very bullish on the Bitcoin dominance for quite a long period of time, and this is one of those things where this macro theory seems to very much be playing out, right? The Ethereum Bitcoin drop, the collapse of the Ethereum Bitcoin pair, and altcoins in general seems to be playing out. But what has not yet played out, or what did not play out, not what is not yet, but what did not play out is the yearly high for Bitcoin being in. So I do want to address that a little bit closer and talk about it and talk about, does it really change the other theories? Because those have been working out. So do we need to reassess those, or is it, still more or less the status quo? So what I would first say with this move by Bitcoin is that I think to some degree I've underestimated just the sheer amount of liquidity in the altcoin market, right? In the altcoin market. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. You're probably thinking, well, there's a lot of new money coming into the space, right? And I'm not saying there's no new money coming into the space, but I do think a lot of what we are seeing is a rotation of capital, right? A rotation of capital from higher risk altcoins to lower risk Bitcoin. That is what I think we're seeing. Now, you are free to disagree with that statement. You are absolutely free to disagree with that if you want to. And I think you could probably find evidence to the contrary, sort of go against what I'm saying. But some evidence to support this view that it's still mostly a rotation of capital is while Bitcoin put in a new yearly high, a significant new yearly high, what you'll notice is that total market cap has not. That doesn't mean that total market cap can't. It just hasn't yet. So at this point, can we even fully say that it's not just a rotation of capital? I would put forth the idea that what we are witnessing is still a rotation of capital. And it's just a matter of how much liquidity is really in the altcoin market. And you can see that the altcoin market continues to bleed back to Bitcoin. One way to visualize this, is to look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. This is a chart we've talked about for a long time. And the reason we talk about this chart is because it shows you the relative valuation of altcoins against Bitcoin. That is the reason why we look at this chart. And when you look at where it peaks out, the altcoin market tends to peak at parity with respect to Bitcoin. So if we were to go take I'm just trying to figure out the arrow. You can see that it tends to peak out at parity with Bitcoin, where the altcoin market cap, you can see the ratio is at 1, is equal approximately to the Bitcoin market cap. And then it goes down to around 25%, right? So here you can see this metric, total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, bottomed out in June, a local bottom of 40%. It then got a bounce, right? Now, we expected this bounce, right? We said, look, guys, we've seen this bounce before from this level. We'll likely see it again, right? The altcoin market will likely at least get some short-term relief against Bitcoin if history is any indication. But the expectation was that it would go up to the bull market support band and get rejected. And that's what has happened so far, right? You can see that it went up to the 20-week SMA and got rejected. Now the question is it going to double bottom here at 40%, or will it continue to go lower? Right now it's actually at 41%, right? But you can see that it wicked down to 40%. My expectation remains unchanged. I do think it will continue to go lower. The trend has been down really since January of 2022, and I think the trend will continue to stay down for a little bit longer. That doesn't mean it can't bounce, right? You could even get a scenario where it bounces back up, to the bull market support band and kicks the can down the road again, right? But the trend has been clear, in my opinion, for a long time that the altcoin market is in fact bleeding back to Bitcoin. Now, I said that I think to some degree I underestimated the amount of liquidity, just the sheer amount of liquidity in the altcoin market. One, in terms of going back to the drawing board, which is what we said we would do, one way to potentially look at this chart is to overlay Bitcoin onto it, right? So if you're to overlay Bitcoin USD onto this chart and go to a daily time frame, and you compare this cycle, you compare where we are now to where we were last cycle and where it ended up leading Bitcoin to be topped out. In 2019, we know we topped out in July. But when we topped out in July, you can see that when that happened, right, if you were to draw a line, it was in June. If you were to draw a line down the page, when it topped out, where was total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin? Where was this metric? Where was it in terms of understanding the amount of just sheer liquidity in the altcoin market? Where was that valuation? And you can see that at the time, the valuation was about 30. Actually, I drew it over one. I need to put it right there. So if we connect this dot, connect the line, that's what marked the top. And you can see that on that day that marked the top for Bitcoin, this metric, total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, actually opened that day at 41% and closed the day at 36%. And that marked the top. Okay? So, to some degree, I think that there's just more liquidity than perhaps I anticipated. It doesn't, in my view, it doesn't really change these macro theories of Bitcoin dominance higher, alt Bitcoin pairs lower, Ether Bitcoin lower. It's just the height at which Bitcoin went to was higher than I thought it would go. So how high can it go, right? That's sort of the question. Well, if you were to go look at Bitcoin, I mean, I probably would just sort of stick generally to what I said going into the year, and that is that it'll likely spend the year between 12 to 35K. But at this point, I can understand why anyone who watching this would just think, oh, well, you're moving the goalpost, right? So I can respect that. So I don't really know how much effort I want to put into, predicting what exactly the short-term top is going to be. I could come up with a lot of examples as to, exactly how high it could go. I imagine if we connect these dots, it would line up somewhat close. Yeah, so it does. But even in this case, right? Even in this case, it could still sort of push up into that trend line for a little while, right? And still potentially hit that 35K level or maybe even over it. Interestingly enough, there actually is a gap that I think we've mentioned a couple of times on the Bitcoin futures CME that is almost now filled. That gap is about just over 35K, and you can see we sort of went up to just below that. And I guess the question is will that be filled or not? Now remember, going back to the total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin chart, this at about 36% is where Bitcoin USD found a top. Okay, and I think the reason why it goes back to what we previously said. That was the level in which there was no longer sufficient liquidity in the altcoin market to sustain these higher Bitcoin valuations. And that's one of the things we said all year is that at some point, the liquidity from the altcoin market is drained to the extent that it can no longer support Bitcoin. So when you see the altcoin market bleeding to Bitcoin, it can send Bitcoin higher, right? But at some point, those altcoins reach valuations where the purchasing power of Bitcoin from those altcoins is just not what it was. You can look at the same chart for, an individual altcoin, right? Like you could look at it for ADA Bitcoin. And, this is one that I've been very, very bearish on for a long time. And it put in a new low today, right? And, I know a lot of people out there are just loving dunking on the view of the year to date or the yearly highs in. But most of the people doing this are also people who have been very bullish on alt Bitcoin pairs, very bearish on Bitcoin dominance. So, don't lose sight of the overall trend here, right? Altcoins are bleeding to Bitcoin. And what you'll notice, if you were to overlay Bitcoin onto the ADA Bitcoin chart, what you'll in fact notice is that where did Bitcoin top out in 2019? Where was the ADA Bitcoin valuation at the time? If you connect the dot, right? So this was the yearly high for Bitcoin. Maybe I need to scoot it over a little bit. Let me get it exact. Sorry, I need to get it exact right there. So where was ADA Bitcoin when Bitcoin USD put in its yearly high? You can see that it was right around this level, right around 800, right around 800 satoshis. Okay, so I think there could be an example of we are now reaching that point where liquidity can no longer continue to support it. But again, I would have said the same thing 2 weeks ago. Okay, and Bitcoin went on to go put in new yearly highs. So, I feel like you do learn a lot when you go through these markets. And I certainly will not get everything right. I try to tell people that all the time, but it doesn't stop when something like this happens. I don't even want to go look at Twitter, to be completely honest. But anyways, Ether Bitcoin. One of the things that we've said is that Bitcoin rallies, what they do is they break alt Bitcoin pairs down so that when Bitcoin rolls over, they have nowhere to hide. Now, Ether Bitcoin is sort of like the king of the altcoin market, right? It's like the index for altcoins in terms of like if they're going to be doing well, they need to be outperforming Ethereum. But look at the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. It's now down again. I mean, the Ethereum Bitcoin capitulation is actually occurring. What's interesting to me is that at the beginning of the year, or let's just say not even the beginning of the year, let's just say 3 months ago, if you had told me, Ben, Ether Bitcoin is going to be sitting at 0.053, Bitcoin dominance will be, 53 to 54%, ADA Bitcoin would have put in a new low, right? And a lot of these altcoins would have just continued to put in new lows, right? Bitcoin keeps putting in new lows as recently as today. Yeah, as recently as today or this week, Bitcoin has put in a new low. AVAX Bitcoin, as recently as today, this week, right, is put in a new low, right? So it's interesting because if you told me 3 months ago that Bitcoin dominance would go up to where it is now and Ether Bitcoin would drop, I would have thought, oh, it's going how I would have thought. But of course, Bitcoin is a little bit higher than I thought it was actually going to go. So it goes to show you that just because some things might pan out doesn't mean that everything will. So what I'm looking for right now with Bitcoin specifically is I would like to see it continue to break these altcoins down off of their support levels. That's what I would like to see. Now, I know a lot of people are potentially distracted by the altcoin market because they're looking at their USD pairs. And why shouldn't they, right? I mean, that's what most people are going to measure their valuations in. But the issue, and I've said this before, is the only reason these are up at all is because Bitcoin went somewhere first, right? And that's the reason why we said, if you want exposure to crypto in the pre-halving year, Bitcoin's where you want to be, because if the altcoin market goes up, it's only because Bitcoin went up first, right? And you can see that Bitcoin went up first. And so yes, now the altcoin market is up slightly, but Bitcoin dominance is up a lot. And now Bitcoin dominance is now in its 10th green week in a row, right? And we said once this thing starts moving, it can move very, very quickly. So that's an interesting thing to look at here with the Bitcoin dominance is that it basically had a perfect retest of the breakout point, back tested that bull market support band, and it's just, has exploded higher ever since. And my view is that it will continue to go higher no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD. And again, I know we're growing old waiting for it to go up while Bitcoin goes down, but that is sort of the view, is that it goes up no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD. And right now, I mean, Bitcoin is currently coming in just shy of $34,000. So looking at a lot of alt Bitcoin pairs, we can see that they are down. We can see that the dominance is higher. If you look at alt USD pairs, they are off their lows. But again, it's only because Bitcoin made that move first. So then what happened in prior cycles, right, is after they broke their support levels, then they had nowhere to hide. So I'm curious if this is the support that actually needs to break, is on the Ether Bitcoin pair. Because one thing to remember is some of these altcoins have already been broken off their support levels, right? Like BNB Bitcoin is now breaking, it's at a new low, right? Compared to where it's been since April of 2021. Like this is a new low since April of 2021 for BNB Bitcoin. It's already broken down off of prior support. Ether Bitcoin, despite how deep of a correction this has been so far, is still technically not off of this final support level. It's fallen off a lot of support levels, right? But it's not off of this final potential support level, which is sitting all the way down at 0.049. Now, I put out some views on Ethereum last week. We talked about how Ethereum's Bitcoin valuation was in the middle of capitulating. A lot of people didn't like that. They had a lot of things to say, especially with regards to the 200-week SMA, but you can see that actually we are now below the 200-week SMA, right? So the 200-week SMA, at least so far, has not come to the rescue of Ether Bitcoin, just like it didn't come to the rescue of Bitcoin USD in 2022, right? Bitcoin USD went below its 200-week SMA. Ether Bitcoin is going below its 200-week SMA. So when I look at this, I do wonder if this is the support that has to break, 0.049. Now, you could look at this in other ways too, and maybe make it so that it doesn't have to go down so much before support is broken. For instance, if you were to look at just sort of weekly closes, you can see we've already broken prior support, assuming that this actually closes at these levels. But again, there's no guarantee that it will. I just think that's another way to look at it. So what I'm focusing on right now is looking to see, does Ether Bitcoin break below these levels? Does it break below these levels? And if it does, if it goes below 0.049, and if Bitcoin rolls over, will Ether Bitcoin continue to go down, which is what my expectation would be, right? I mean, there's still, I mean, you still have the spot ETF stuff. You still have the halving for Bitcoin. I do expect the dominance to continue up through the end of the year. I think there can be a case to be made when you get to the halving year, especially early on. What we've historically seen with dominance is that it tops out sometime early on in the halving year if it didn't do it in the pre-halving year, at least a local top. But for the next 2 months or so, I still would expect the Bitcoin dominance to ultimately trend higher from where it is right now. And I know it seems like it's pretty high right now, but I still think, I mean, if you think about it like this. If you look at like BNB Bitcoin, it finally broke support here, which is where it was in April of 2021. Right, this is April of 2021 was going up. Ether Bitcoin, where is it now? I mean, it's at the same spot it was in June of 2022, but also where it was back in April of 2021. Why is April of 2021 important? April of 2021 is important is because that's when the Bitcoin dominance started to really drop. So I'm arguing that we're basically just retracing that move to the upside, where all this money from the altcoin market is now bleeding back into Bitcoin. I don't think it's imminently leading to new highs for Bitcoin, like, or new, macro highs, new all-time highs. But I think that it has been supporting the price of Bitcoin this year, even as recently as yesterday, and then at some point, I think that liquidity rolls over. So what I will focus on is Ether Bitcoin. Is it breaking below that level? Looking at alt Bitcoin pairs to see if they're showing any strength, because on some time frames, or some altcoins have, but a majority of them have not, right? I mean, and you can see pretty clearly when you go through most of the list, they just continue to put in new lows for this cycle. So I would focus on alt Bitcoin pairs, focus on total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. But there's this other thing we have to consider as well, because one of the things I said early on is I think I underestimated just the sheer amount of liquidity in the altcoin market. And if you go look at total 2 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, it's still way up here, right, at 73%. Now, in 2019, when Bitcoin USD topped out, if we were to look at on a daily time frame here, where it topped out in 2019, where was this metric? So if we sort of draw the line from that high right here, you can see that it was around 59 to 60%, right? 59 to 60%. So in that sense, there does seem to be more liquidity, but a lot of that excess liquidity now that I think can help support Bitcoin is mostly in Ethereum. It's mostly in Ethereum. And the reason I say that is because a lot of the altcoins, we just gave one example, right? Like ADA Bitcoin. A lot of the other altcoins haven't even been around. Like we can't even look at Polkadot or Solana or Avalanche last cycle because they just simply didn't exist. You can look at ADA and see that where it was when Bitcoin found its yearly high was around these levels. But the Ether Bitcoin pair is still a little bit higher. And one way to maybe visualize that is to look at the Ethereum dominance, right? So if you look at the Ethereum dominance continues to plummet, and the Bitcoin dominance continues to go up. So I think there's a case to be made. Here that the Ethereum dominance will continue to drop significantly over the next few months, and a lot of that will likely go into Bitcoin. So remember, total market cap is an interesting measure of the market because it has not yet taken out this yearly high. Now, look, I've learned my lesson. I'm not going to say that it can't take out the yearly high. It could. I mean, Bitcoin took out its own yearly high. Okay, so it could take out the yearly high. What I am arguing is that at this point, this still, to me, represents a rotation of capital from the altcoin market to Bitcoin. Because in today, total market cap is, just north of 1.2 trillion. But it was also north of 1.2 trillion back in July, and it was north of 1.2 trillion back in April. Right? So, and every single one of these moves, what has changed? The Bitcoin dominance has gone up for every single one. So on the first peak here on total at around this level, 1.2 trillion, dominance was at 47%. At the second peak of it, dominance was at around 50%. On this potential third peak, dominance is at 53%. So you can see that capital is rotated from altcoins to Bitcoin. And there was sufficient liquidity in the altcoin market to sustain a new yearly high for Bitcoin. Now, in terms of where we are right now, we have looked at the year-to-date ROI for Bitcoin, and I did want to at least pull this chart up because I know a lot of you guys are familiar with it. If you look at the year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin and you kind of compare it to the average of 2015 and 2019, you can see that it's above this level that it was at on day 308. And it's almost to the point of where it maxed out by the average. So if you're wondering where that 35K number came from, it's not a mystery, right? I've said before, the reason why when going into this year, I said that I think Bitcoin would be between 12K to 35K this year was I just looked at this average and said, all right, well, if you can see it's 2.1x right here. If Bitcoin goes up 2.1x off the yearly open, that more or less puts it at 35K. But when 35K did not happen back over here in the summer, I just was assuming that it was not going to. Turns out it still more or less happened. I mean, I know we haven't technically hit 35K, but we have come pretty close to it. So I would look to see if, if this ends up acting as any type of resistance, that 35K level, or if we just slice through it, right? And there's just much more liquidity sort of come in. The other thing to look at is if you actually just compare this move to 2019, this is exactly where we saw a very similar move to the upside. In fact, that rally by Bitcoin in 2019, if you guys remember, it actually, I think it topped out on October 26th. Not that it means, of course, not that it means anything necessarily for this rally. This is a new yearly high as opposed to a lower high, which is what we had in 2019. But you can see, in fact, it topped out in October 26th. So I guess the question is well, what's keeping Bitcoin from just sustaining the uptrend, right? I mean, it's still been a series of higher lows and higher highs. What's keeping it? Well, I think the biggest risk to Bitcoin, and I've said this all year, is nothing crypto specific, right? I mean, is the SEC has lost a lot of cases against the Cryptoverse, and so it's not crypto specific. I think the biggest risk to cryptocurrencies today is just sort of the macro view, right? The macro outlook. And it is surprising to me that the S&P has continued to put in lower highs and lower lows while Bitcoin made this move. Now, if you were to show me the altcoin market, I would say, all right, that seems pretty similar to to what's going on with the S&P, right? It's just been a series of lower highs and lower lows for a few months, which is exactly what we're seeing go on over here in the S&P. But Bitcoin has gone up. And again, the reason, liquidity from altcoins to Bitcoin, from alts to Bitcoin. And that is my view. And it will continue to be my view until we get back to looser monetary policy. One reason that people have faded the Bitcoin dominance for a lot of this move is because they say, well, last cycle it topped out in September, right, of 2019. So why shouldn't it have already topped out? But remember, as I said previously, the reason that you could argue that it topped out in September last cycle is because the Fed had already started cutting rates. So we were going back to looser monetary policy. The issue today is that we are not back at looser monetary policy. And so why would we assume that the Bitcoin dominance has topped out? I would assume that as long as monetary policy remains restrictive and the balance sheet continues to be reduced, there's a good chance that the Bitcoin dominance will continue to trend higher. Now, remember, after the Fed started cutting rates, that did not mark the bottom for a lot of altcoins. The altcoin market, especially on their Bitcoin pairs, they still took another month or two. A lot of them took a couple of months even after the Fed started to cut rates, right? So you can see here the Fed cut rates in August, but the Bitcoin dominance still went up for another month, right? So even when you get to the first rate cut, it doesn't even necessarily mean that the altcoin market has bottomed out. It could mean you still have to wait another month or two. It's one of the reasons why after a Fed pivot, the stock market usually tends to still go down. It's because on the first rate cut, it's often not enough of an instantaneous thing to actually change the overall market. And then Bitcoin, of course, did go into a downtrend until we got to the last rate cut. But I think the important thing is that dominance did not top out until after the Fed started cutting rates. So if you're surprised that dominance has continued to go up, despite it being past September, remember, whatever direction dominance is going into September, it normally reverses course out of it, and that has been true once again, right? Dominance went down into September, and now it's moved to the upside out of it, and I think it will likely continue. So I think that is mostly what I wanted to talk about. I think the only other thing to mention in terms of, total having not yet taken out this yearly high is to look at total 2, which includes Ethereum, and that one has actually been putting in lower highs. So that's a little concerning for Ethereum, if you exclude Bitcoin, because it really shows just how weak Ethereum has been. While total market cap, where you include Bitcoin, has basically been going up to the same level that it's been at, right? And just overlay total market onto this chart, and you can see what I'm talking about a little bit clearer, right? So total market, you can see that it keeps going back up to the same level, whereas total 2, which excludes Bitcoin, keeps putting in lower highs. So again, for me, this is just still a rotation of capital until proven otherwise, right? Until proven otherwise. So hopefully this video is useful to some people. And again, I know some people are going to be, have all sorts of things to say, and I don't really have, a great response other than to say I'm going to get things wrong, and I underestimated the amount of liquidity in the altcoin market. I still think the overall trends are intact. Bitcoin dominance higher, Ether, Bitcoin lower, alt Bitcoin pairs lower, and that Bitcoin is if you want exposure to the cryptoverse in the pre-halving year, Bitcoin is generally where you want to be. Yes, there are a few altcoins that outperform it, but they, generally speaking, are few and far between. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.